some bits of we've seen in the last week alone some prime examples of the level of problem that violence against women is in Irish society. We've seen thousands of images of women and girls shared online without their consent, causing huge hurt and trauma for those involved. The government have acted under pressure and under the reaction of the public, but it's taking far too long to bring about change on these issues. We've also, many of us have been hearing about an incident in a school where 12-year-old girls were called out to be talked about their clothing and their bodies and how it could potentially be a problem for men or boys in the school. And while accounts may vary, the reality of it is that young girls should not be made to feel in any way that their bodies or their clothing is a problem for anybody else or has any impact on how men are likely to behave. And I think it speaks to the objectification culture that we have that starts at an extremely young age for girls and women. Daily, we're seeing as well rape myths and victim blaming continuing in courts. And we are seeing that this is a constant feature of the judicial system, and we still await the radical overhaul that is so clearly needed and that we all marched about over 2.5 to 3 years ago, following the Ulster Rugby rape trial in Belfast, and following the using of a woman's underwear against her in a rape trial. COVID has also brought about, thrown a spotlight on what's now been called the shadow pandemic. Obviously, it always existed, a huge level of violence against women in the home, but the escape routes and the relief that women might have been able to get are now being closed off because of lockdowns. Internationally, there's a massive spike in calls for help to the police and to agencies. So tonight's meeting has been organised by Rosa, which is a socialist feminist group that I myself was involved in establishing shortly after the tragic death of Savita. Rosa campaigns and discusses issues of women's oppression, takes actions on gender violence. For example, we were involved in Belfast in the I Believer marches, in Dublin in the We Stand With Her protest, and also with actions around This Is Not Consent following the Thong issue in a Cork court. But Rosa looks as well at the systemic links that exist between violence against women and capitalism itself. When you have a grossly unequal society that thrives and needs sexism, racism, and inequality and division, that promotes or has promoted patriarchal structures throughout its history, that encourages a macho culture and rigid gender roles, well then that is a recipe for the continuation of violence against women and girls and gender-based violence as well. So those are some of the issues that may be touched on by some of the advocates and activists that we have tonight. I would say that there won't be time to have a discussion after the speakers, but people are welcome to relay questions live on the live feed, and we can put them to some of the speakers. But just to say that Rosa regularly meets and has discussions on these issues, and I can announce the next meeting at the end. So without further ado, our first speaker is Karen Dempsey. Karen is a local activist in Dublin 7, in the Dublin 715 Action Against Gender Violence campaign that has organised protests and petitions on issues. And we thought it would be very important to have a speaker reflecting local campaigns that are taking place. Karen, as you can see, also has a young baby, so as many women do, and she'll speak whenever she's free there. Karen, we totally understand. You can start whenever suits you.
Thank you, Ruth. I see my video seems to be playing up all of a sudden as well. But lovely introduction, and as I said beforehand, I hopefully can't imagine a more sympathetic audience to this baby with a paintbrush, which stop brushing, which may distract me. Actually, can I have 5 minutes?
I'll come back to you.
Thank you.
Okay?
Yeah,
no
perfect.
Problem. That's no problem at all. These things happen. So look, our next speaker is Madison Clark. So if it's okay with you, Madison, we'll take you now. Just to introduce Madison, she has just finished her master's in Queen's University Belfast, and she's done very interesting and very important research on the impact of gender violence on how women behave. So Madison, when you're ready, thanks a million for joining us tonight, and we can start.
Yeah, thank you so much for asking me to join tonight. This is such an important conversation, I think, to have all these different voices present for us. So I greatly appreciate that. As was mentioned, my research was done for a degree in conflict studies. So it's definitely coming from that angle specifically. So for this presentation, I'm focusing on how ingrained and interconnected it really is across so many global societies that women are taught to employ behaviors to protect themselves from gendered violence. So to begin, 2 quick definitions. First, I'll speak about opportunistic gendered violence, which is a term that I coined for this project. Describes spontaneous actions that target others based on their gender presentation. And it's done specifically to exert dominance over them or to negate their autonomy. So for this project, I focused on public spaces, which is bars, clubs, sidewalks, public transportation. So that means that this opportunistic gendered violence includes catcalling, groping, harassment, intimidation, assault, and rape. The other definition to begin is militarization. And it's the process that creates soldiers, essentially. It alters the way that someone thinks and behaves, and it really rewires people so that they are now capable of both accurately and calmly assessing potentially violent situations, and that they are also prepared to take the correct actions if necessary. So basically, militarization is battle readiness as a prerequisite for any sense of peace. So for my project, I was researching what parallels can be drawn between women's behaviors out of concern for opportunistic gendered violence. Can I be heard okay? I saw some waving. Okay, I saw a little, I was like, let me double check. So I was researching the parallels that could be drawn between women's behaviors out of concern for opportunistic gendered violence in public spaces and the formal militarization that trains soldiers. So I was aiming for a wide sample because research has not been done on this before. So I surveyed 1,171 women. They ranged in ages from 18 to 79. And these women currently or previously reside in more than 80 different countries. So I wanted to capture as wide as a sample as humanly possible. My results found that 99.4% of women reported having employed at least one militarized behavior that was described in the survey. Also, 72.1% reported having employed at least half of the behaviors. So these are not random incidents. It's not just me and my group of friends. It is very much a global circumstance. So a few comparisons directly between militarization and everyday women's behaviors. One would be constant vigilance. The lines between violence and safety for women in public spaces are very rarely clearly delineated. So when we are on public transportation, women reported standing near exits, waiting to the last moment to exit in order to reduce potential followers, sitting next to women whenever possible, and other such constantly vigilant behaviors. Second, they also emphasize spatial consciousness. So this is an awareness of both what space a woman is taking up and what other people may be too close. So in order to combat this, women use their body language, commonly referred to as resting bitch face, because how dare we not be smiling at all times? And that's how women are combating this militarized coming on from other people. Third, there's routinization, which essentially is the establishing of a routine to offer a sense of normalcy or predictability in the midst of women having to deal with so much uncertainty regarding when violence will next occur in public spaces. So one example would be all the women who reported never leaving beverages unattended while in bars, pubs, restaurants, on coffee dates, working in a coffee shop by themselves, etc. And the last specific militarized behavior I'll mention here today is camaraderie. So essentially it's reflecting that sense of mutuality that for women, because we know what can happen to any one of us at any time, we do look out for each other. One particular example that I focused on was the sending and receiving of names, contact information, photos, etc., before going on a first date or before getting into a rideshare. Really any circumstance where a woman knows ahead of time that she could be alone with someone that she does not know or does not trust. So essentially the legacies of militarization is how these behaviors are learned and passed on. The biggest difference between soldiers who go through militarization and everyday women in public spaces is that we do not experience deployment or the end of conflicts. Our experience of this violence does not end. Our civilian life is simultaneously our conflict life. So there's lots of research done on how veterans re-enter societies and what should be done to welcome them and help them adjust. And then you have the everyday expectation that women should know these behaviors, deploy them appropriately, never speak about it, never ask for help with the trauma of these experiences. There's absolutely a genealogy of violence here. Respondents cited so many different people that they learned these behaviors from. It included parents, siblings, peers, social media, television, teachers, therapists, blogs, and so many more. And the vast majority of those that were named specifically were all women who had passed on these behaviors. Speaking specifically to the media, many different respondents brought up how militarized behaviors are used as quirky stereotypes. You hear those jokes about how women always go to the bathroom together and blaming women for daring to go outside after dark or for consuming alcohol at all, which certainly ties back to those rape myths that Ruth was speaking about earlier. As one respondent put it, quote, "It's hard to watch a woman get murdered at the start of every television episode and not pick up on things she did well or could have done better." So this is just so incredibly ingrained in society. And so many people, I've already started hearing it, will hear this and think, oh, don't be dramatic. That's just self-defense, which is simply untrue. Self-defense is reserved for occasional moments. It's a knee-jerk reaction in particular situations. Whereas women's militarized behaviors are anticipatory, strategic, and constant. We employ small-scale strategies to try and navigate violence while also attempting to pursue some semblance of autonomy within this patriarchal culture of terror. It's so ingrained that many different respondents of all ages and in different countries reported feeling concerned when they purchased new cars that only had a digital fob for entry and no longer had a metal key, because so many women use metal keys as potential weapons when they're in public spaces. Really, all of this perpetuates a culture which has normalized keeping women focused on protecting their pursued bodies first and pursuing our potential second. As I mentioned at the beginning, this is research that is very much in the early stages. This is not research that's been done before. I would love to pursue a PhD in this area because I think this is research that can impact policy. It can impact what organizations do to support women who experience violence. It can support the mental health treatment that women receive. Speaking specifically to two parts of research, one would be in terms of capitalism. The amount of women who mention that they are purchasing weapons, paying for extra taxis for safety, or purchasing cars so they can avoid public transportation altogether. And especially when you consider the pay gap as well. And then you think about who that money is directly benefiting, and it sure as hell is not coming back to support women. The one other issue I will point to for future research would be in relation to COVID. Really, I see this as just another safety issue for women to be concerned about in terms of what militarized behaviors they use and when. Because when experiencing opportunistic gendered violence, if someone is too close to you and is not respecting your autonomy, not only are you risking gendered violence, but you're also risking exposure to COVID, which we're still learning so much about in terms of long-term effects. So I think really the number one takeaway here for women, I would say, is the fact that you're not crazy. You're not the only person doing these things. You're not doing them for no reason. You're very much using these things strategically. These are taught with a purpose. And as long as we exist in this society that we do globally right now, it is important for us to continue to take on as much as we can in terms of keeping each other safe and keeping an eye out for one another whenever possible. Thank you.
Madison, thanks a million for that. That was really interesting. And as you say, it's amazing that that research hasn't been done before. And it really shows the pervasive nature of this and the unconscious nature that women have to adjust their behaviors throughout their entire lives and just assimilate that idea. So thank you so much for that research and for sharing it with us tonight. Thanks. So our next speaker is Karen Dempsey. As I mentioned, Karen is involved in a local campaign in Dublin 7 against gender violence. So Karen, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Ruth. Yes, take two, hopefully a little bit better. Paw Patrol has taken over. Wow, following on from Madison, my God, that's phenomenal work you're doing there, Madison. And I suppose our angle is that really kind of grassroots movement to combat so much of what you're actually speaking about there, the reality of it. So I'm from Dublin 715 Action Against Gender Violence, and it's a movement, I suppose, that sprang out very much out of the repeal referendum campaign. So in our local area, we were campaigning, and it was actually amazing that it was such a great networking, I suppose, piece where so many like-minded people came together. And when you have that kind of power and camaraderie, you can really hopefully make things move and change. So once we got repeal over the line, which was phenomenal, we really wanted to keep the momentum and continue this fight against the inequalities and the various different oppressions that working class women were experiencing. Gender violence was one that was particularly high on the agenda, a hugely pervasive, I suppose, and politicizing topic. It was what got a lot of people out the door and actually really active and motivated in the community. One of the big issues was that a refuge in our local area was so underfunded that they were turning away 500 women in a year, which, I mean, we're talking about, it is a geographic area, it's got a huge population, but that is a huge number to be turning away per year. And we now have, I mean, we lost Ruth in the Dáil, but we have 3 elected representatives in the Dáil who really this doesn't seem to be on the horizon. It's kind of a blip on their radar. So this day last year, we had a meeting in November 25th in Hartstown, and it was really, really well attended. We launched our campaign, and women across the entire community took activist pacts. So they included in that letters to the then Taoiseach, Leah Varadkar, and they had leaflets, window posters, badges. We had stalls at shops, really kind of got active and visible as much as we could in the community. Gathered 500 letters, and we presented them, 500 letters from constituents, and presented them to Leah Varadkar at the Dáil when he was Taoiseach then. So this got a lot of media coverage to highlight the crisis and what was really going on, the truth of what was going on in the local area, and so much that again was just under the radar. It wasn't actually coming on the radar until it was forced on. So the momentum was building. We were getting a lot of coverage, getting a lot of activity going on, and then COVID hit. So that restricted us for various reasons, not least the fact that we were then restricted to our 5K in terms of any activities we were organising. But we've pushed through. But the other things, I mean, we were restricted by the 5K, but also the general domestic sphere that a lot of us are working from, which you can see my little sidekick here tonight being a good example. But the world became so small. We were very much confined by cleaning, work duties. People who had to go out and work for their income didn't have the option and were very much frontline workers. So we were quite impacted on what we could do for all those reasons. But at the moment, one of our very current campaigns, and we were actually there this evening before this, is around the showing solidarity with the survivors of the mother and baby homes. There is one of the biggest mother and baby homes in Ireland, is St. Patrick's on the Navan Road, which is just up the road from me here. I'm in Dublin 7. And when it was becoming apparent that the government were actually seriously thinking they were going to push through sealing the documents, sealing the archives, we came out, and again, in force and very emotively and very passionately, people came out, didn't really know how it was going to work. I mean, we're in a pandemic, what's going to happen? We wore our masks, we socially distanced, and we went to both the site on the Navan Road, where we held a vigil with survivors, and also when the president, Michael D. Higgins, signed over the paperwork on his side, we had a vigil outside Áras an Uachtaráin as well. So again, just really trying to keep the spotlight on we've 3 elected TDs in the Dáil at the moment. So really trying to keep the spotlight on them so that they know that we are not going away, we're not forgetting about it, we're keeping all the pressure on as much as we can. But one of I suppose a couple of the big things that we got from our approach is a really, really good feedback and really good insights into the energy that ordinary local people have for these topics. Ordinary local people really do want to get behind it when they're given somewhere to focus their attention. We can really kind of harness that and challenge all of these sexist, misogynist, racist, classist, all of these pieces that feed into gender violence and consent and coercion. And as Ruth began with, the really clear situation that's going on at the moment in the schools around telling young women, young girls that they can't wear certain clothes because of their gender and because of the impact it might have, modifying their own behaviour based on what men in teaching roles might actually do about it. So yes, I think we're going to say as much as I could in a very small bubble here while waving a cornet around while there was silence. But I'm really, really delighted to be here and great to see such amazing work going on in the world around these topics. So thank you.
Thanks a million, Karen. Thanks very much. And not easy, as was said. A lot of people are working from home, and it's so difficult right now. Our next speaker, this is obviously the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. This is a global problem, and thankfully there have been huge global movements on this issue, much more so than in Ireland actually. So our next speaker is by video. We have Jane Barros. She is an activist in Brazil, where there's been, obviously throughout Latin America, there's been the movement against femicide and the Ni Una Menos campaign, which has reached across several countries throughout the continent. some of the most oppressed women in the world have taken action on that issue. And also, particularly since the election of Bolsonaro, who is a misogynist, a homophobe, a racist, etc., and has been, a huge impetus to women to have to campaign. So we're going to watch this video from Janae now.
América Latina. Olá, camaradas, eu sou Jane Barros, sou militante feminista socialista e componho esse movimento internacional feminista em defesa da vida e do direito das mulheres, sobretudo das mulheres trabalhadoras. Primeiro, queria registrar que o dia 25 de novembro, para nós, mulheres brasileiras, mulheres latino-americanas, trabalhadoras, é um dia extremamente potente, é um dia muito importante, porque é um dia mundial, internacional, de combate à violência contra a mulher. O que nos mostra que ela só é mundial e internacional porque o capitalismo, de maneira conjunta, encontra formas de violar os nossos direitos, violando os nossos corpos, retirando o trabalho e criando políticas e ausência de políticas públicas que nos impactam diretamente no dia a dia. Então, para nós, a luta pelo fim da violência contra a mulher, ela precisa ser necessariamente uma luta anticapitalista, porque esse sistema é responsável pela produção e pela perpetuação das políticas e ações machistas e sexistas. Vejam, a gente vive uma dura realidade no Brasil e na América Latina no que diz respeito à morte de mulheres, ao feminicídio. Na América Latina, a cada 20 horas, pouco mais de 20 horas, uma mulher é assassinada. No Brasil, no ano de 2018, a cada 2 horas uma mulher era assassinada. A gente está falando de números extremamente alarmantes, que mostram como o Estado desvaloriza e nos desrespeita enquanto sujeito. Durante a pandemia, essa situação se agravou. Do ponto de vista da dificuldade dessas notificações e, ao mesmo tempo, do aumento sensível do número de mulheres vítimas de violência. Alguns organismos aqui conseguiram registrar um aumento no mês de abril, no início da pandemia no Brasil, de 400% do número de denúncias que chegaram por telefone, por internet, de mulheres que estavam sendo vítimas de violência. A pandemia nos provou que o capitalismo ficou nu. Quem tinha alguma dúvida ou alguma esperança que era possível ter condições melhores de vida dentro do capitalismo e juntamente com esse sistema, perdeu as esperanças nesse momento. A CEPAL revelou que durante a pandemia, até o mês de setembro, 34 milhões de postos de trabalho foram perdidos. A grande maioria no setor de serviços, que empregam significativamente a mão de obra feminina. Isso significa que retirar trabalho, nos colocar em situação de maior precariedade de vida é uma forma bastante violenta, bastante agressiva contra nós mulheres, uma ação bastante agressiva contra nós mulheres. O Estado encontra uma série de maneiras de nos violar. O não direito, a retirada dos nossos direitos, a inexistência de aborto legal no conjunto de todos os países da América Latina é uma forma também de perpetuar a violência contra a mulher, nos obrigar, inclusive, a manter uma gestação vítima de estupro ou de violência, tem sido uma das realidades tristes em vários países que não garantem sequer o aborto legal para a totalidade das mulheres vítimas de violência. O momento anterior à pandemia foi um momento de potência de luta. Era um momento de retomada da luta das mulheres no conjunto da América Latina. O 8 de março de 2020 foi marcado como um ponto de inflexão. O processo prévio mostrou a capacidade das mulheres chilenas, mexicanas, brasileiras e argentinas de colocar milhares de mulheres nas ruas. Mulheres jovens, trabalhadoras, mulheres aguerridas, que foram às ruas lutar e dizer em alto e bom tom que as nossas vidas importam. No entanto, a pandemia colocou obstáculos para nós, mas não obstáculos absolutos. Agora, no dia 17 de novembro, o presidente da Argentina foi obrigado a apresentar 2 projetos de leis, fruto das lutas anteriores na Argentina, mas também no conjunto da América Latina, aonde ele apresenta um projeto sobre a legalização do aborto e o outro a política dos 1000 dias. São 2 projetos que conjuntamente significam um avanço do ponto de vista do direito reprodutivo das mulheres, que garante ser mãe e que garante poder interromper a gravidez uma vez sendo esse o desejo. Esses projetos só foram possíveis pela quantidade, milhares, centenas de milhares de mulheres nas ruas da Argentina, que impactaram, inclusive influenciaram lutas em outros países da América Latina, inclusive aqui no Brasil. Nós seguimos nessa luta. Agora, mais precisamente no mês de novembro, as eleições regionais no Brasil mostraram e foram também capazes de canalizar uma parte dessa luta e uma parte desse descontentamento com o governo Bolsonaro, com o governo de extrema direita. Mulheres socialistas, negras, trabalhadoras, trans foram eleitas em todo o país. E foram eleitas porque são vistas como representantes da grande maioria das mulheres. E isso nos coloca e nos mostra que é necessário e é possível retomar as lutas, que existe um espaço para nós, que existe condições de construir um movimento potente no Brasil, no conjunto da América Latina, mas no mundo, para derrotar esse sistema, para acabar de uma vez por todas com o descaso e com a violência do Estado capitalista sobre os nossos corpos. Seguimos juntas, seguimos firmes e seguimos unidas através do feminismo socialista para a construção de um mundo onde caibam todas nós, todos os nossos corpos, com muita vida e com muita potência. Seguimos. Obrigada, camaradas.
Okay, so thank you for that amazingly inspiring video from Janae, and solidarity to our sisters and brothers in Brazil and Latin America who are dealing with such difficult conditions right now. Before I bring in our next speaker, just to say that there is an attendance sheet in the comments section where people can leave their name, their email, their phone number, etc., to get more information and to be kept in touch with future ROSA meetings. Also, if you have questions for any of the speakers, you can put them into the chat. They'll get picked up and they'll get relayed back to us to take up. So I want to introduce our next speaker, who's Nolene Blackwell. Nolene is the CEO of the Dublin Rape Crisis Centre and a national, the foremost spokesperson on the issue of sexual violence in this state. And I'd really like to thank Nolene for agreeing to speak tonight, because I know today is a particularly busy day for many people who are involved in agencies that are dealing with gender-based violence. So Nolene, thanks so much for giving up your time tonight. There might be questions that come up, but work away and speak whenever you're ready there.
Great, Ruth. Thanks a million. I'm delighted. Thank you very much indeed. It's a great privilege to be invited to talk and to discuss. And in a sense, while it's a very busy day, it's a good busy day. It's a good day that there is a focus on the elimination of violence against women and girls. And today is that UN Order Day. And it's a good day because it allows you to answer the question that you get asked about once a day in my job, which is, what about men? And why is there a day for the elimination of violence against men as well? Ruth, I'm going to set my clock going, but you might stop me if I'm going on too long. So it's a good day to remind everybody of the very gendered nature of violence against women, picking up on Madison's points about the power dynamic that underlies so much violence against women. It's a day to focus in on that. And the four themes of this year's International Day, which is the start of the 16-day campaign, which will run until International Human Rights Day on the 10th of December, 16 days of action against violence against women and girls. The four themes of today are fund, respond, prevent, and collect. And I'm just going to touch on each of them just as I see it, that and as we see it. So Dublin Rape Crisis Centre is one of 16 rape crisis centres, all of them independent organisations around Ireland, but roughly formed into two kind of umbrella groups. One is the Rape Crisis Network of Ireland, which has some of these centres, and then we're part of the Rape Crisis Centre Forum, which is another one. So kind of two umbrella organisations. That's okay. We need two voices at least in this particular conversation. There are others as well, like One in Four and Carrie, which deals with sexual violence against children. So I'm just going to talk a little bit maybe. So our services include face-to-face therapy for people. And in 2019, we dealt with about 650 clients. We'd expected to deal with about 700 this year, but the pandemic has made a change to that. We run the National 24-hour helpline. It is being extended this year, following finally getting some funding for it with a web chat as well. We've started an online counselling programme, and we accompany people to the courts and to police stations to make reports. And then we work, we have services in education and training, working with frontline workers, working with teachers, parents, and others in the area of training. And then we try and do advocacy, which is where I would have come across Ruth in terms of not having to persuade her at all to take up causes of violence against women in the Dáil, and she continues to do it to this day. So I'm just going to kind of touch maybe on the four areas that are the themes of this particular day in reverse order. So the last of them was collect, and that was about collection of data. Because one of the biggest problems, and even touching on what Karen was saying there, with 500 people denied places in refuges in your area in 2019, the data we have is absolutely so poor as to make it really, really hard to produce the evidence that shows the extent of this problem, the hidden nature of the problem in the first place, the fact that nobody wanted to hear about it for a long time. The fact that people have to speak so loudly to keep it in the agenda means that the data we have, the information we have, makes it really hard to understand the prevalence of sexual violence and the trends. But just today, a new survey done by the psychology departments of Maynooth and Trinity College showed what seems to be a rise in the instance of serious sexual assault, rape against women and men, and an increase in the level of sexual harassment as well. The last decent study being in 2001, published in 2002, it was definitely a different time in life without the internet, for instance. But so it looks as if there is an increase. But it's hard to compare because the questions may not be comparable. That's why information research such as Madison's is so important, and I'm absolutely certain is translatable to our situations all over. Because I even remember Dublin City Council did some work on this some time ago, identifying public spaces, public transport as issues as well. So we do not have enough research, even with what you've done, Madison. So I hope you get to do your PhD, and I hope we can continue to collect more, because it looks like the problem is high. The problem of sexual violence against women and men is highly, it is at the level still of an epidemic. And indeed, our programme for government identified sexual and domestic violence as an epidemic, and has set out a number of ambitions, all of which are good, provided they come up with them. but some of the issues around, but anyway, so data is a core problem, and until it is solved, we will not be able to progress with a good understanding. And in the meantime, like I keep saying to people who have money to spend on this, like government, how do you know you're spending money in the right place if you're not supported by the data? The second, last in this, but I'm using it as the second, focus is prevention. And it is an absolute shame that this week we are still having to say that image-based sexual abuse is not criminalized. And for so long as it's not criminalized, it's really hard to get the social media companies to take it down. That's what we find. So it's this focus right now on legislation and the pushing through of legislation can only be welcome. Will it do the job on its own? It will not. But at least if we can say that our laws have caught up with the internet, so that people can actually be prosecuted for the abuse of a person through stealing their image or using it non-consensually. If that is there, it is more than we have today. And it's sad that we're saying that in 2020 in relation to something which was identified and a solution given back in 2016. And so therefore, while I think it is a matter of some concern to so many people that images may be being distributed more widely than people ever thought. Even, and I'm not just talking about the intimate images that somebody is having distributed and abused by a partner or ex-partner, but that even more widely, that it does create a level of concern in many people. We're getting some calls about it onto the National Helpline, not a lot, but of course, the thing is, you don't call unless you know your image has been abused and or stolen. And very often that can come very late in the day, and it can come in a shockingly bad way. So the legislation is a help. The next stage of this will be the media, the broadcasting bill, the name of which has just escaped my mind, although I was speaking about it an hour ago, where the social media companies will be, this is the organization of digital media and the digital commissioner. This is a piece of legislation that I think will be hard fought by the social media companies, many of whom are headquartered here, and where they will not want too much interference with their model of sharing, because sharing is how they make money. And the truth is that in doing that, the consequences for people who are victims of digital abuse they're a byproduct of that commercial reality for the media companies. So I guess we will be hearing a lot more about that. In terms of prevention work as well, the work on consent is nowhere near where we need it to be. Ruth mentioned that a case where a female senior counsel was still referring to a girl's underwear in a closing argument in court 2 years ago. I think it was November 2 years ago, if I remember, or maybe even just last year. But anyway, it was a scandal that the law still, that a senior lawyer still thought that was a kind of mitigating circumstance. And in that case, again, we have waited since the declaration in April 2018 for a justice system that would at least require our lawyers to be trained in this area. The recommendations have come out. Credit where it's due, the Minister for Justice has worked very quickly since those recommendations came out in August to move them forward. But as of yet, there are no programs in place to train lawyers, including judges, and all those dealing with victims. The new systems have not been put in place, making it still really hard to report. When I went in, I'm a solicitor, and when I went in to work in the Rape Crisis Centre nearly 5 years ago now, I was full of it, how we were going to get everyone to go in and report. Now, if any of you or my friend came along or my family member came along and said, I suffered sexual abuse, should I report? I now have to tell them how hard it remains. And until we solve that, we are going to remain in deep difficulty. I will just very briefly say in terms of responding and funding. The respond was about the necessity to respond to the COVID, to the COVID pandemic. It has been hard. The experience of sexual violence services in Ireland has been similar to that in many other places around the world. Those who suffered physical violence reported quickly, and those who suffered sexual violence, yet again, reported far more slowly. So that really, while we had our worst restrictions in March, people did not start beating our doors until June or July. And since then, the list of people waiting for individual service has risen by a third, and the numbers of people calling our helpline has increased enormously as well. And the calls are so intense and so sad, and people are so bereft because their escape mechanisms a lot of the time are missing as it stands right now. But it's still a grief, and it's a sense of, I think, how far the campaign against sexual violence has to go, that people still put it as the last thing they complain about. So I was raped by my partner. That can wait. No, it can't, because the hurt and the harm done is huge. And it's an abuse. It's an abuse of a person's human rights, their rights to health, their right to justice. And we have to seek to eliminate that harm and that abuse of rights. And that's, I think, what we're all aiming at in our own various ways. I leave it at that, Ruth, but if I'm missing anything that you needed me to cover, feel free to say it.
Thanks, Noeline, that's fantastic. Very difficult to cover this, but I think there's one thing really struck me when you were speaking, that the leading person in the Rape Crisis Centre in Dublin can't even encourage her own friends or relatives to definitely report a rape. We have a serious problem, and I think that says it all. There's a couple of questions for Madison and for Noeline, so I might give you them now if that's okay. Madison, a couple of people have asked, is there a page or a website where your research can be looked at?
There's not currently. It was just submitted in September, so it's very, very new. I am happy enough to provide an email address that folks can reach out to, and I can send through a PDF of the research. So I can do that, and we can throw that in the chat. I'll do that here in a second.
Okay, that's great. And we can put that up maybe on the Rosa. We can post it on the Rosa page as well if needs be, or the Facebook page. Yeah, there was a question for Noeline about image-based sexual violence. Should we have new legislation then? But I'm assuming, Noeline, you would agree that there should be.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And then the person also asked, another person asked, I'm wondering if there's any counselling services for victims of digital abuse.
Yeah.
And I would imagine getting help is just as important as stopping it. Do you want to take that?
Absolutely. It's a really good point. And I knew I flew over a whole lot of things there. You see, digital abuse is only a way of doing sexual abuse. To our mind, it's no different. I mean, I saw that people were talking about maybe a separate helpline or anything. Fine if that's useful, but it is sexual abuse. If somebody takes your intimate image or an image of you which is sexual in some way or another and abuses that image by sharing it, by stealing it or whatever, that's sexual abuse. It's simply using the internet rather than a physical system. And to our minds, that's what it needs to be named as. And it is harmful. And therefore, of course, people are it is as harmful as other forms of sexual abuse, and people are entitled to it. It is their right to seek help. We're doing our best. We have too long a waiting list at the moment. It's not the length of the waiting list, it's the length of time people are waiting on it. That's too long at the moment. But we really would urge people who've been victims of it. The harm is real, and and they are entitled to seek help, and they should do so.
Thanks, Nolan. If anything else does come in, I'll put it to you. And I really, again, appreciate you for speaking tonight.
My pleasure.
Our next speaker is, again, we've a video from Russia. Now, people will know that in Russia, there's been an almost legalization of violence against women in the home. I visited Russia myself 2 years ago and was just inspired by the bravery of feminists, LGBT activists, and socialist feminists in Russia who were organizing so secretly, like in an underground fashion in reality. And also those people who were willing to defy the ban on protest. You need a license to protest. One person can protest at a time. This is what people are dealing with, and it's, you know, really brings it home how difficult this issue is, and also the role of the church in Russia. So our next speaker on video is Etain Yakubova, and Etain was among some people who took part in a protest today in Russia for the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women, which I understand 7 people were arrested on, which is par for the course in Russia. So have a look at this video.
Всем привет, меня зовут Айтен, я из российской секции социалистической альтернативы. Также я представляю соцфем альтернативу, это наша феминистская организация в России. Меня сегодня попросили рассказать о том, что такое 25 ноября для нас в России и что мы делаем в этот день. Вообще, 25 ноября – это Международный день борьбы за ликвидацию насилия в отношении женщин. Насилие в отношении женщин крайне распространено во всем мире, присуще всем культурам и странам, затрагивает женщин вне зависимости от их расы, достатка, происхождения и так далее. Женщины сталкиваются с насилием постоянно, на работе, на улице, даже дома. Насилие, в свою очередь, бывает разным – сексуальным, физическим, психологическим, экономическим. Но для нас в России наиболее актуальной является проблема именно домашнего насилия, и в этот день мы акцентируем свое внимание на нем. Потому что пару лет назад статья «Побои» была убрана из Уголовного кодекса и сделана административным правонарушением. То есть теперь, если ты бьешь жену или детей, тебе достаточно заплатить штраф, примерно 5000 рублей, и все. С тех пор, как была декриминализирована эта статья, случаи домашнего насилия увеличились, но при этом женщины, которые обращаются за помощью, их число стало гораздо меньше, потому что если ты обращаешься за помощью, вас штрафуют, и этот штраф снимается из семейного бюджета, которого и так ни на что не хватает. То есть получается, что женщина сама, в принципе, платит за то, что ее бьют. Мы, которые уже в целый год пытаемся добиться принятия адекватного закона о домашнем насилии, но пока что наше государство отказывается его принимать. Для того, чтобы стало более наглядно, хочу привести несколько примеров из статистики. Каждая 5-я женщина в России подвергалась домашнему насилию. 90% пострадавших от домашнего насилия – это женщины, дети и пожилые люди. В подавляющем большинстве случаев они подвергаются насилию со стороны мужчин. От 55 до 95% женщин, подвергшихся физическому насилию со стороны партнеров, никогда не обращались за помощью. Основная причина этого – это стыд, страх, который внушает нам общество, экономическая, психологическая зависимость от насильника, труднодоказуемость факта насилия. Жертвам насилия у нас в стране некуда идти и не у кого просить помощи. Наше государство не строит кризисные центры, и есть несколько НКОшных центров, и государство их не финансирует, то есть не помогает. Безвыходность толкает многих женщин на отчаянные меры. Пример – сестры Хачатурян, убившие отца, который годами их насиловал и избивал. Суд над сестрами до сих пор идет, то есть прошло уже больше года, и они не могут добиться какой-либо справедливости. Истории, подобные сестрам Хачатурян, происходят очень часто. Данный кейс просто очень известен, и мы о нем знаем. То есть существует тысячи историй, о которых нам вообще ничего не известно. Одна из самых частых причин попадания женщин в тюрьму – это превышение самообороны. Женщины вынужденно защищают свою жизнь ценой свободы. У нас есть статья в Уголовном кодексе, которая называется «О причинении вреда при превышении пределов необходимой обороны». И эту статью в профессиональных кругах смело называют женской статьей. Данная дата для нас, как соцфем-альтернативы, имеет особое значение. Мы возникли, на самом деле, довольно недавно, то есть вот скоро 1,5 года, как мы существуем, как фем-организация. И в прошлом году нам удалось согласовать массовый пикет на 25 ноября. Это было наше первое масштабное громкое мероприятие. Пришло около 1000 человек, хотя изначально было заявлено 50. То есть 1000 женщин о нас узнали, о нас написали все СМИ, все соцсети, люди передавали информацию о нас друг другу в личных аккаунтах. И, в принципе, та известность, которая у нас есть сейчас среди женщин, мы ей обязаны той акции, которая была. Это было довольно яркое выступление. В этом году мы тоже попытались согласовать массовый пикет. Естественно, нам отказали, потому что помимо прочих причин еще и добавилась пандемия, из-за которой ничего невозможно согласовать. Но мы все равно вышли на улицу на одиночные пикеты. Одиночные пикеты – это пока что единственный способ, который у нас остается для того, чтобы хоть как-то выходить на уличные акции. Именно по данной теме мы выходим со следующими требованиями. Принять закон о домашнем насилии, финансировать кризисные центры за счет государства в каждый район, снять все обвинения сестер Хачатурян и других жертв насилия, которых судят как преступников, ввести программу переобучения для полицейских и судей. Чаще всего их действия являются травмирующими, так как они не знают, как вести себя жертвами насилия, вернуть статью побои в Уголовный кодекс. Также мы глубоко убеждены, что причина насилия чаще всего экономическая зависимость женщины от насильника. Поэтому мы требуем достойной зарплаты вне зависимости от гендера, доступное качественное образование, медицину, жилье без кредитной кабалы, социальную поддержку, пенсии и льготы для незащищенных слоев населения. Сегодня режим продолжает закручивать гайки абсолютно по всем направлениям. С каждым годом все более и более усиливается ориентация на традиционную семью, на скрепы и на вот этот вот весь бред. Но мы в СФА не сдаемся и продолжаем работать, продолжаем бороться абсолютно по всем направлениям и стараемся привлечь и включить в нашу борьбу как можно больше женщин из рабочего класса. Я считаю, что нам это удается, потому что с каждым, скажем, даже не годом, а месяцем и днем у нас в организации все больше и больше женщин из рабочих семей, студенток и так далее. Вот, в принципе, все. Спасибо вам огромное. Желаю удачи и сил в борьбе и вам, и нам. Спасибо, товарищи.
So, many thanks to the activists who've sent us those videos for tonight, and our absolute solidarity with them in the really difficult conditions that they're fighting under. So we should continue to give them any support that we can. Our final speaker tonight is Keris Valby. Keris is an activist with Rosa in Belfast. And Keris is going to speak about her own experiences and also about Rosa's view on these issues. So Keris, when you're ready.
Okay, thanks very much, Ruth. My name's Keris and I'm a Rosa organiser in Belfast. I'm very honoured and slightly intimidated to speak after all of these amazing women. But I'm going to do my best to try and bring the conversation together in 10 minutes or so please bear with me. we've heard from a number of speakers this evening, and their contributions are invaluable, really, to a discussion on gender-based violence and how we fight it. We've heard accounts of the myriad ways that women are suffering right now, and globally we've seen COVID further worsen the conditions of almost everyone from every walk of life, unless you're Jeff Bezos, of course. But I think it would be fair to say that none have bared the brunt of COVID quite like working class women have. The most recent PSNI, which is the Police Service of Northern Ireland, domestic abuse bulletin, showed this, as records of domestic crime have increased during lockdown while overall crime levels have fallen. Women are also more likely to bear the brunt of increased care work required in the home during COVID, and are more likely to work in precarious and low paid positions. Even when women have the supposed luxury of working from home, this is always coupled with an expectation of increased levels of housework and so on and so forth. But I'm sure I don't need to depress you all with an account of how awful our existence under capitalism is. I want to focus on what's necessary to transform the lives of women and oppressed peoples around the world. So sexism and LGBTQ+ oppression as well are completely ingrained into the capitalist system. Historically, it benefited from the oppression of women with the promotion of the nuclear family in order to control bloodlines and therefore inheritance. So basically, if you shove all the women back in the home and morally vilify them for any sense of independence in life, then you can pretty much guarantee that your offspring are yours. However, today, our oppression performs a very key and profitable role within capitalism. The unpaid care work, which is undertaken by women worldwide, amounting to about $10 trillion a year. To be clear, this work is absolutely essential for society and therefore capitalism to function. If there was nobody to clean, cook, organize, raise children, then capitalism as we know it would crumble. Without this work, there would be no profits to be had, as you wouldn't have a healthy and educated workforce. So why don't they pay women to do this work then, given that it's so profitable for them? The simple answer is that they don't have to. If they can foster a societal expectation on and kind of conditioning of women to undertake care work for free, then they have less costs and, like, simply put, can make more money. Without the oppression of women, capitalism couldn't function. So societies which rely upon women's oppression for this functioning end up needing to control women's sexuality, with the nuclear family being one expression of that. But gender and sexual violence, including just the threat of it, are very much a necessary tool to force women into submission, including, things like a limited access to reproductive rights, etc. So all forms of gender-based violence are connected by the fact that the objectification of women's bodies is at their core, it's their basis. So furthermore to the benefits reaped by oppressing women, capitalism also seeks to benefit from divisions within the working class as a whole. So if they can sow these divisions, be it gender, race, sexuality, sectarianism, even obviously in the North, then we will be too busy fighting amongst ourselves to see the wood for the trees and connect our struggles together. Because that would be a real threat to them. So they have to consciously make that move to divide us. I think it's also worth noting that capitalism itself, it perpetuates gender-based violence because by its very nature, it's a violent system. How can we end gender-based violence when imperialist wars are devastating much of the Middle East? How can we end gender-based violence when the two options for president were both accused of sexual assault? How can we end it when a man was suffocated to death because of the color of his skin? And how can we end gender-based violence when they've covered up the truth about what went on at mother and baby homes? And how can we end it when we're being forced back to work in unsafe conditions for the sake of the profits of the ultra rich? In case you haven't got where I'm going with this, we can't. There is absolutely no way that we can end gender-based violence whilst existing under a violent system. Capitalism relies upon violence for its existence, with the police and army being its most obvious expressions of this. For example, in the US, at least 50% of male veterans with combat-related mental health issues commit intimate partner and family violence. And at least 40% of police officer families experience domestic violence, as opposed to about 10% of the general population. When you're indoctrinated with the idea that violence is a necessary evil in order for society to function, then it's completely unsurprising that these behaviors would repeat themselves in the home life. We've heard a number of statistics about the increasing rates of gender-based violence. But it's important to notice that, alongside this, we're also seeing a huge backlash, and behaviors that may have been tolerated even in 10 years ago are no longer accepted. The global women's movement has absolutely exploded in recent years, with millions of women and non-binary people taking the streets to demand that enough is enough. The global and youthful elements of these protests, they differentiate it from previous feminist struggles, and they hugely open up our opportunities to win real change. This new feminist wave has also been particularly marked by an increased working class participation. And I think this opens up opportunities for us to, connect economic and social demands and unite together to fight back against this rotten system. So, as I've said, that women's oppression and therefore gender-based violence, it's not going to end under capitalism. So whilst we fight wholeheartedly on absolutely any reform which will improve the conditions for working class people, I do not believe that this is enough. We cannot reform ourselves out of hundreds of years of social conditioning and a system which necessitates our oppression. In order to do that, the whole system must go. We therefore think it's extremely important that we break away from these strands of feminism that attempt to endear themselves to the elite. We don't need more girl bosses. That's not empowerment. Hillary Clinton and Margaret Thatcher do not inspire me. I'm inspired by the Debenham workers stood out on the picket lines trying to get a fair deal. I'm inspired by the Chelsea girl strikers, the Dagenham strikers, I've written that, but similar. The endless list of women revolutionaries who sought to theorize and end the exploitation and oppression rife in the capitalist system. And our fight is a collective struggle. It's solidarity. It's fighting alongside other sections of the working class across the world to end capitalism. So how do we end gender-based violence? We can't rely on the courts or the state. The Cork and Belfast rape trials prove that. We can't rely on individual female figures to lift us up. So that just leaves us with ourselves. The only thing capable of ending violence against women is an organized movement of women, the youth, and other oppressed groups and the working class as a whole, who are prepared to fight. So I would like to make a plea that anyone listening to this gets involved. Sign up to Rosa and please help to be a part of the fight back. On a personal note, I can say that as a survivor myself of rape and sexual abuse, I can tell you that there is absolutely nothing more empowering than fighting to rid the earth of all exploitation, oppression and suffering. So, thank you.
Thanks, Keris. Thanks a million for trying to pull the meeting together and put a socialist feminist perspective on it. Just before we finish up, there's a few things that I just need to say. First of all, there's an attendance sheet that will again be put into the comment thread on the live feed. And we'd really hope that people would leave their name and their details. Secondly, I've just had a message about Russia and a bit more detail, and people are asking for our international solidarity and for us to act on this in the next 24 hours. So if you could bear with me. Solidarity is required for activists in Moscow who were arrested today on the International Day against Violence Against Women. Once again, Moscow police have acted in a completely unjustified manner. In St. Petersburg, a picket was held peacefully and successfully. But in Moscow, the authorities refused permission for an action, fearing it would be as big as last year's when over 1,000 people attended, which is amazing in Russia, believe me. And so it seems that today the authorities have tried to make arrests to deter people from protesting about the misogynistic laws that have been brought in. So 6 people who are members of Socialist Feminist Alternative were forced to resort to a single person picket, which is the only legal form of protest allowed. And from 2 locations, 11 people were arrested by police and taken to 2 different stations. The first 5 were released after a couple of hours, but the 6 taken to the OVD Samaskarov station have been told that they've been charged with disobeying police orders, and they'll be held for at least another 48 hours. So this is very serious. The 6 people, I won't read the names, but I would have actually met some of them when I was there myself 2 years ago. And they have been visited by a lawyer. They've been passed food and water. So we're being asked to contact the police station where they're being held, particularly if you are a public representative, but also to email the Russian embassy here in Ireland. So what we will do is we'll ensure that a post is put up on the Rosa page now with some of those details, and it would be great if people could actually act on that, because I know from experience that the fact that the outside world, is responding when these sorts of things happen is hugely important. There was another question in the thread as well about how can people show solidarity to these struggles that are taking place around the world. Well, it is something that Rosa does pride itself on. In fact, there have been Rosas set up in other countries, which was pioneered here in Ireland, prior to the battle for repeal. And so, I would strongly advise you to keep in touch with the Rosa page, which regularly has, campaigns and issues that people can support. There was one last question for Nolene, which was in the live thread, and then I can just announce the final meeting. So Nolene, it was the point you made about not, definitively encouraging somebody that you knew that they must report a rape case. Somebody was saying, is that because you just have no faith whatsoever that they'll get a conviction? So if you wanted to maybe answer that, because it might have caused some.
No, it's not really that. It's just that the process is so hard and there's so many steps to it and it takes so long and it's so wearing. And in sexual violence cases, almost in intimate violence cases, uniquely, you have to hang on to all the harm and the memory of all the things that went wrong, which inhibits your capacity to heal your innermost self. And fixing those things would make a huge difference if all the recommendations for reform are implemented soon and easily. It would be that bit easier to have faith, because actually for those who go through, the conviction rate is good, and there are successful convictions, prosecutions and convictions, but it's so hard on victims, because what they do is try and squash a system which isn't suitable. They try and squash intimate violence crimes into a system that is utterly unsuitable for them. And that's the problem. It's the wear and tear on victims. So hats off to all those, A, who survive and who thrive afterwards, and B, to those who will go through the justice system as well, because it's tough.
Okay, thanks, Nolan, and thanks a million again to all of our speakers, Madison, Keris, Karen, Nolan, and of course our international speakers as well, who I think added to the whole evening. And hopefully we can collaborate again on many projects and actions. Again, a last appeal to people to please leave your name and details to be informed about the next ROSA meeting. Well, one of the next meetings is Global Revolt, Socialist Feminism, now more than ever. And it will be a discussion with a bigger focus on questions and a back and forth, maybe some of the questions that didn't get answered tonight. And there's no doubt that if any other issues come up in relation to gender violence, that we'll also be organising actions on those. We Rosa has been recently extremely supportive of the Polish community, who have been organising against the completely backward anti-abortion legislation of the government in Poland and assisting in the solidarity protests with the Polish community there. So again, many thanks to everybody, and keep in touch with the Rosa page for news of that activist who've been arrested in Russia, and many thanks to everyone. Thank you.